Welcome to the Small Church Podcast, where faith, community, and ministry intersect in the unique context of smaller congregations. I'm your host, Tony Marr, and I'm thrilled to be joined by two men who are convinced they're a little bit more talented than I am.
That is right. I'm Robert Kell, one of those supposedly more talented guys, co-host and fellow small church leader. Together, we're here to explore the challenges, triumphs, and inspiring stories within the tight-knit communities that make up our smaller churches.
And I'm Bruce Montgomery, the one here to bring even more to the table than these two and offer a unique perspective to our conversation.
So whether you believe this talent hierarchy or not, you're in for a treat. If you're a pastor, a church member, or just curious about the world of leadership, you're in the right place.
Each episode, we dive into topics that matter to you, from innovative ministry ideas to navigating the unique dynamics of a smaller congregation.
So grab your cup of coffee, settle in, and let's journey together through the wonderful tapestry of small church life.
This is the Small Church Podcast.
Welcome to the Small Church Podcast. I am Tony Marr, and I'm thrilled to be joined in studio by Robert Kell. And Robert, we have a very, very special guest with us today here in studio. We have Kris from Farm Bureau.
Woo!
And I know that when we were talking through this episode, you got really excited because you thought I meant Jake from State Farm.
Yes.
And you thought, is he bringing Patrick Mahomes with him? Is he bringing in Steph Curry? Who's going to be on the show? And I said, no, it's Kris from Farm Bureau. He's even better than Jake from State Farm.
Isn't it Chris Paul? Isn't Steph Curry
Chris
even
Paul.
isn't it Chris Paul? Is Steph Curry in the State Farm commercials?
I don't know. Maybe not. Chris Paul.
I would take Pat and Gronk or Kelsey. He could bring his girlfriend.
Yeah, get his Mahomes and Maato.
Yeah.
That was a good commercial. That one was funny.
And then Travis could bring his girlfriend, and that would be a great interview.
Kris, why doesn't Farm Bureau, Tennessee Farm Bureau Insurance have Chris Paul or Patrick Mahomes on commercials?
Well, that's an interesting question that we need to probably call and see if somebody at the home office could answer that for us. But probably a lot to do with budgeting as to how we would want to promote Farm Bureau and all the different things that Farm Bureau stands for, and the reputation that we have and all of that stuff. It will be hard to it's hard to go out and pick a celebrity.
You can really just say, we want you to have lower rates and to pay for those guys, your rates have to go up.
To say that, I don't want to get into promoting the rates and get into rates of this company versus that company, but you have to imagine what kind of costs get passed along when you pay professional athletes that make $20 and $30 and $40 million a year money to come and do your commercials, multiple times a year, and put, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Aaron Rodgers and Patrick Mahomes and all these people in your commercials. For that to be, what you guys are budgeting for, there's no telling what's going to get passed along for that.
Yeah. Dude, the Arnold commercials were hilarious. So that might have been as top 3 Super Bowl commercial for sure.
It was a good one.
It was really good. You get Arnold involved in that. I mean, you're pulling somebody out of the woodwork there, but he's not been relevant for a long time.
I was going to say, you say woodwork, I say my childhood. Yes. I mean, that is a big part of it.
So we do have Kris Null from Tennessee Farm Bureau here with us this morning, and excited to have him. I know Kris pretty well. I have a joint bank account with him. I send him a lot of money because I have a lot of kids that drive, and he's done a lot of great things for us. And I know that my wife, Amanda from Ludecker-Marr Property, has worked with him quite a bit. He's amazing at helping new home buyers get home insurance. But today we might touch on some of that a little bit for those of you that are out there that are maybe coming up on your policy renewals. But we really want to focus today on the unique circumstances that churches face when it comes to insurance. And in a lot of my conversations with small church leaders, it's something that is missed all the time. I'm amazed at how many times I talk with small church pastors, small church leaders, and we're just talking through budgeting things and looking at their budget, and they're missing so many important coverages and important things that their church has. And then sometimes there are a lot of small churches out there that don't have any kind of coverage at all that I think today is going to be very informative, very helpful, and educational for a lot of our listeners out there. So, Kris, first off, thanks for joining us. We jumped right in and didn't say thanks for taking time out of your day. We appreciate that. What are some of the biggest misunderstandings and maybe misconceptions that churches have about insurance?
I think a lot of times churches get into worrying about the expense of it, for one thing, of course. And they also have kind of maybe a false sense or a false hope of how much that people are, when it comes to thinking, down the road of what people would be willing to do against the church. They're like, oh, surely that, no one's ever going to do that. Our church members have been here a long time. We've got a good core of people. No one would ever come against the church in a lawsuit or things like that. And, people, we hope that that's the case. Everybody hopes that's the case. We hope our customers in insurance wouldn't, want to sue the company over something because, we've taken care of them for years. But the truth is, your family, your friends, or whoever, there's no way to protect against or to say that they're never going to come against you for anything. And then you have to kind of be prepared for that, or otherwise, financially, as we kind of talked about before we got started, that could sink a church. And, that mindset could sink a church to think of, we don't need to carry this coverage for liability because that could never happen to us. In all honesty, there's nobody that's protected from liability suits.
Yeah. And I think that with larger churches, a lot of times they have someone who's educated and probably works in the insurance profession, in the industry, and they can kind of coach and guide their church along on, no, you're missing some important coverages that we need. You're not fully looking, we're not adequately insured for our needs and the size of our church and our building and all of the different ministries that we have going on. But I think smaller churches often miss that. They miss out on what they need, what's important, and really what's required. Is there any law out there that says these are legal requirements that churches have to have if you're operating as a church that you need to have?
To my knowledge, I don't think there's necessarily any kind of minimums or anything like that they impose on churches like they would on, generally if somebody's doing contracting work or something like that, they're going to need $1 million of liability to show to everybody that they're doing work for. And when it comes to a church, they are protected from a lot of that stuff because they're not governed nearly the same way. They're not, there's not as much legislation and all this stuff to say what churches can and can't do. They're kind of self-governing in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So they're protected from a lot of those minimums and requirements and all this stuff as a way, in my opinion, of giving them a little bit of freedom. Because at least, in our country at this time, we're still giving churches some freedom, especially in our areas. But also, that just gives them an opportunity to not force high expenses on churches and, try to protect them that way. But then, by not having those requirements, then that puts them in a situation where, like people who would drive without car insurance or whatever, it puts them in a financial bind should something ever happen because they're, not required. And, some states wouldn't require car insurance or whatever. And to not require insurance leaves them very vulnerable. But again, you don't want to get into forcing insurance on a church, so it's a slippery slope there, I feel like.
So a small church that has very limited budget, maybe they're even looking at having to make budget cuts some places, and you look at their policy and see that they don't have adequate coverage. What are the things that you say these are essential for any church, regardless of size, that you have to have?
Gosh, that's kind of tough because when you get into the size of churches, it does vary as to what you need. But, used to, it was probably just some general liability that you would need for on-premise, injuries or something like that may happen. But then what you really get into is, misappropriation of funds. Somebody accuses you guys who are on the board of the church or the board of trustees or deacons of misappropriating money, making bad investments, sexual misconduct, all of those kind of things that ruin reputations of the church, ruin them financially. It doesn't take much to sink a small church, as we've talked about, when, if you're not properly protected. One of those accusations where you're just out defending yourself, if nothing else, just those defense costs, if you don't have the proper insurance, would do it, whether or not they were awarded any money or not.
Robert, how much influence do you have into the insurance coverage and policies decisions that your church has? I know that as part of a network, you probably have people who look at that. Is that something that you're ever involved with?
I'm going to have to say I would assume we have insurance. Like, so if that answers your question, I mean, it's really just not something, as an executive team, like our campus pastors are a part of the executive team, but, so I sit in those meetings. I have one tonight, but we don't, we discuss some of those things, but it's not, we've got attorneys and insurance people and accountants and stuff that sit more in that space and work with our lead pastor. Work with our lead pastor on some of that stuff.
Yeah. Kris, you mentioned liability insurance and different coverages of that. What are some of the key things that you see are critical in that for churches?
Nowadays more so than ever, sexual misconduct is always in the news. It makes the big headlines. It's, ruins the reputations the most of the church and the people involved. And to have a general liability policy or a, business owner type policy on a church that includes those things, or at least offers those, I think, those are kind of the most important things. You got the sexual misconduct, you've got the officers and directors coverage. And that goes back to, the officers and directors is a lot of that would be if people in the church, again, didn't agree with the way that the church spent their money, if, it was spent on some vacations or money was spent some way they didn't want it to be spent or invested in a way they didn't want to be invested, that protects them from those lawsuits, the church itself. And then the sexual misconduct, there's a couple different definitions of things that would fall into that, to where it could be like a negligent supervision, which would mean like, had they have supervised the pastor or the member of the church that was accused of this properly, that would have never happened. So that's where they get in the door to sue the church for that. Hey, if you were watching them better, this wouldn't have happened. Also just, saying that, from the beginning, they maybe swept something under the rug that came through on a background check or was on the resume, that maybe they thought, hey, this is not a big deal. And they completely, let that come on in, ignored all that, and they're negligent in that way. So, there's many different ways, or whether, there was an accusation prior while they've been at the church and they allowed the person to stay as an employee or, a board member or whatever, and they kind of left that. So all those are kind of the three main categories there that it would fall under. And those are the ones that, anybody could say, if you were supervising that person better, that wouldn't have happened, and that's such a broad way to do it, but that's such an easy way to get a lawsuit going. Like, well, if you were watching, that wouldn't have happened.
And we're seeing this all over right now. I mean, I could probably name 5-6 different cases that are in the news right now. There's a church that's in the headlines almost every day right now because of the malfeasance that was taking place with the senior pastor and the leadership of the church, with moving their personal home into the church's name so that it would be safe from lawsuits. And now the church and their leaders are being sued by multiple plaintiffs for misappropriation of church funds. And so this is the kind of thing that officers and directors insurance protects the leaders of the church. And so you may think, if you're listening to the show right now and you're an elder or a deacon or a leader in the church, thinking, oh, that's not anything that I need to worry about. It is. Because if you are, by being an elder in a church, a deacon in a church, you assume some level of legal responsibility for the actions and decisions that are made by the church. Right. Something that I think is important is that your general liability coverage, if you're a church leader and you say, we know that we need insurance coverage on our building, we've got a building that is paid off and it's been around for 120 years. Your general liability coverage that you get by just calling up Kris Null at Farm Bureau is not going to include these things. These are additional riders that your policy needs to have, correct?
Right. Yeah. So you need to have something that's tailored to your type of business, whether, a sexual misconduct being added on, and those things are really not things that would be added, for me, owning my office. Or things that we really would talk about and having an office of an insurance office or whatever, those may be things through your employer liability or something like that would be covered. But there are church specific type coverages that you need to focus on when you're going to get these coverages, because general liability, in the most broad sense there is going to be covering for bodily injury and things like that, just that happen on premises. And then when you get into worrying about the things that are specific to a church, you need to get those. Kind of like if you have homeowners and you want flood, well, you need to get flood coverage. Otherwise, if there's a great flood, it's not your regular homeowner isn't going to help you. Or an earthquake, you're going to need to get that. Those are things that aren't just part of your base packages. And you need to have somebody that explains those things to you and say, hey, these are things that can happen in your situation. We're putting the ball in your court here to say these are, available to you. Should you decline those, that's okay. But these are the ones that are specific to a church, and you need to really focus on these because these are important.
Yeah, I think they're crucial in today's world. That maybe these weren't that big of a deal in the 60s and 70s, but in the environment, the culture that we live in now, I think they're crucial that every church, regardless of size, has these riders in their insurance, these policies that are protecting them and protecting their leadership.
Right. And these things aren't things that we always had as part of our church policies. But in the last few years, we've really revamped the church policy to make it more of a comprehensive thing that can add all of this so that it's available because, of all the businesses, we want to make sure that churches are protected. That's something that's near and dear to all of us from, whether you may attend one now or you've grown up in one your whole life. And you just think, that's an industry that needs to be protected. You need to do everything you can to protect that because you don't want a church being run out of business because you didn't go through their proper channels with their policy and go through everything that you could with them. Or, hey, our policy is a little cheaper. We can't offer all that stuff. You don't want to be on the hook for that, should something happen. You just don't want to be a part of that.
And that's something I was going to say is that, you mentioned like having those conversations and the agent, sharing these things. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I know we moved to Florida for a couple of years. And if we hadn't been told you need flood insurance, we'd grown up in Northeast Tennessee, North Georgia. We didn't have floods. That wasn't something there. And so we ended up like buying a house kind of right off a bayou area. And so it was very easy for the floodwaters to get up and come over if we would have gotten a big, huge storm in the time that we lived there. And that's one of the things is that a lot of times, and you kind of, excuse me, I'm sorry. You kind of alluded to this in the fact of that it's in an effort to get clients. Sometimes insurance companies will be like, oh, here's the cheap policy. Right. And they don't share, hey, here's the add-ons that you need. And it stinks that there has to be add-ons. It's, you hate that but also like if an insurance policy is $10, which if it is, let me know where to sign up if it's a good policy, and I'll be there tomorrow. But if it's if a policy is $10 and we push it to something and somebody's like well, but then it's $2 for this add-on, $2 for this add-on, $2, or we could just charge everybody $20, but everybody doesn't need the extra add-ons. And so how do you as an agent, how do you kind of ease some of the tension, but also help people understand the hard questions of like, hey, I know it's hard to come off that money. I know it's hard to look at this from this perspective, but how do you encourage, and maybe for our audience, how do you help a pastor, a leader walk into a room of people who are only going, the bottom line says, and say, hey, I understand the bottom line, but we need to be aware. If we want to be here in 5 years, we've got an article we're going to talk about before the episode's over. If we want to be here in 5 years, there's things that happen sometimes that flip the world upside down.
Right. And, when it comes to that, it's always a tough conversation to have because, there's car salesmen, insurance salesmen, lawyers. Those are people that people always have a negative.
We're super trustworthy of all those people.
Yeah, absolutely. Trust us at home with your kids and your grandmother and whatever. People.
Sadly, pastor is becoming one of those in a lot of
a lot of negative connotations with all of those different things that we mentioned. And unfortunately, you would think that pastors would be kind of the last ever to have a negative light shed on them. But these days, because only bad stuff gets in the news, you get that. But, people think that when we sit down and we talk to them and we go over their policies with them, that we want to sell them something. Like we want to maximize that premium that's coming out. And
because the insurance on your Lexus is expensive, and you need to cover that. So you're just trying to rob us.
Yeah,
that's really where a lot of people think. And I'm joking, of course.
Yeah. But that's kind of just what people are programmed to think. And like you buy your Lexus and you've got $25,000 of property damage on your auto insurance policy, and we're like, hey, the next level up's 50. But that still doesn't cover the $75,000 Lexus you may hit. Like you really need to be at the 100.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're just trying to quadruple my limits, and it's like, well, that for most people, we're changing those limits. Yeah. For 16-year-olds, changing limits is a little bit more pricey. For someone our age, to go from 50,100 limits to 250,500 limits.
Did you see how he looked right at me
15
when
or 20.
He said for a 16-year-old?
Yeah,
you might
you're
have
the perfect example.
You might have two getting ready to do this.
I do have to.
But because of that, also, you have to think of the fact of, I've got teenagers out who are historically not the best drivers, inexperienced, and I've got to protect our family financially and everything that we've built by having the proper limits so that if someone does get injured in an accident, that they're not coming after us and taking everything we have.
And the reason it's called insurance is because it's insurance in the event that something goes wrong. You hope that you never have to use it, but in the event, you would hate to be underinsured and then
when you find out about then you're mad at us for not selling you that.
Yes.
And that's what we're trying to protect ourselves against, is having these conversations and saying, okay, hey, you can have the base. But I think what's ruined a lot of people's opinions is a lot of kind of misleading marketing where it's like, name your own price and those things, where those companies are, they're great, they're big companies, whatever, but they offer options to people to pick their own coverage without those people having any knowledge of what they're taking off.
This isn't a make your own meal at Taco Bell or Burger King.
Right. We're not.
Yeah, you're not guaranteed a burger, fries, drink, and a dessert. Like it's like, oh, hey, make your own meal, but you might only get the burger at the price point you choose. And that's a complicated thing when we're talking about buildings, and we're called to be good stewards of the resources that we're given.
Right.
And so I think that's hard. I think that's the hard thing about this is when we're bad stewards in that space, it can just really cause some tension down the road.
Kris, is it important for our listeners to understand, and maybe this has changed in the 7-8 years since I have sat down with an insurance agent to look at a church policy. Not all insurance carriers are going to provide these coverages. And again, maybe I could be wrong. Maybe that's changed now. But if you're in a small church and you have someone in your congregation or someone in your congregation's son or grandson is an insurance agent for ABC insurance company, they may not offer all these different coverages that you need, but they want your business. So they're going to say, yeah, our liability coverage that we're going to give you is going to be just great. It's important to make sure that you're finding the correct coverages because they might not be available with everyone. Maybe you need to hurt some feelings by not using the grandson of your patriarch at the church because you need to have the coverage that you need.
Yeah, and that's another tough thing because, especially in a small church, it's a more of a tight-knit community, and you seem like every person in the audience, and you do know that Joe's son sells insurance, and you would hate to upset Joe as one of your core members of your church, so you'd like to use him. And a lot of times that's fine. But what you run into sometimes is, this negative thought of, well, if we buy that policy from this big company, it's going to cost more because we see their marketing and all this stuff. And, Joe's company is more of a small company and it's going to save us some money. But the truth is, a lot of those times, the smaller companies may not have the huge surplus to where they have, the ability to have a little bit lower rate for that market. It may have to be high because, they're not really financially where they should be to be able to take on that risk. And you just assume with small companies are going to be smaller rates, and big companies, we talked about the marketing of State Farm and all this place, all this stuff is that, with that budget, you think that their policies have to be high or, whatever the case may be. When the truth is, you can have a good comprehensive policy at also a good fair price, but people just think that, we couldn't go outside of the church for that, or we couldn't, we don't trust that person outside the church. They're going to just try to sell us money, something that's going to make money off the church on. And, they don't give all the right opportunities there to protect. But you're talking about being a good steward of the church's money and those things and looking out for the church's future. Having that narrow mindset of we have to keep it with this person we've had it with, that's inside the church, and we don't really understand, what we may or may not be losing, that those things these days kind of have to go out the window, because you have to do what's going to be best for you and make sure that you're going to be protected. And, that person may have proper coverage at their insurance agency and all that, but also you need to take a look at it regardless and just make sure, because a lot of companies don't have specialized policies for those things. Yeah, they'll give you general liability and they'll build the church back if something happens. But all the little things that are church specific, they're not offered everywhere. That's for sure.
Something that I want to throw at you, a little bit of a curveball. This is not in our show notes that I sent you last week, but it's something that I've had brought up in conversations. That was a deep
breath right there.
Yeah. I'm ready for this.
We're going to see just how good you are, how well you know your insurance.
Okay.
Something that I've had brought up in 2 different conversations over the course of the last week or so is churches' auto policies. Okay. That a lot of churches have church vans.
Yes.
A lot of them are old. And a lot of churches just hand the keys to the church van over to anyone that's a member of the church.
The 14-year-old that thinks they can drive.
Or even lend it out to someone else. I've been the beneficient of that recently. And that could be a problem. I've also had other churches that say we've decided to stay away from buying our own church vehicles and just rent them. And one of the key reasons they said was because then the rental enterprise is responsible for the insurance on it. And that's not always the case either, is it? Can you speak to that for a minute and what churches need to be looking at with their church vehicles?
So with the church vehicles, especially in the small community churches, things like that, they are more likely to loan those out. And the problem you get there is, if they rent those out, you can't, there are people that have church vans that they will rent to other people if they need them. Well, then that's a whole different thing versus having, your normal commercial policy for your church and for, running the church van out and picking up kids or whatever, or someone who's elderly or just whatever reason they'll need to be on the church van. That stuff's all fine. And that's going to be part of your typical commercial insurance for a church. But then if you are renting out your personal property to someone else, then that's a whole different thing that, for example, like we wouldn't cover that. We would have to send you somewhere else for that, because that's a whole different risk when something that you own and that we insure is in somebody else's hands and we don't know who's driving it. We don't know what's going on with it. We don't know what's happening.
So a quick pause right there. You would still be able to insure my van as I own the van at the church, for our church. You'd still be able to insure our van, but then we would actually have to go somewhere else, get a separate policy for a rental type of insurance coverage. We wouldn't necessarily so it's a total, not even an add-on. It's a total separate policy from what we're looking at.
Yeah, really, if you're doing that, you would need to have one policy that would cover all of that.
Okay.
Ideally, you don't want to have 2 insurance companies covering the same vehicle, and you've got one company with this coverage over here, and you hop in this vehicle doing something else, and now you've got different coverage and different people protecting you and different deductibles and different liability limits and all that stuff. You really don't want to do that, because when you've got 2 different insurance companies covering the same thing, then it creates gaps. Like if you were to have 2 different car insurance policies, say that you have one and Amanda has one, and you guys are both named insureds because you guys are married. Then Amanda goes and buys a car over the weekend. Well, technically, you could add that onto your policy or her policy. And technically, most auto insurance companies have a grace period there when you go buy a new vehicle that it doesn't have to be added right away. And if you totaled it over the weekend, you would still have coverage. But technically, we would be covering that vehicle under your policy, and her policy would be covering that vehicle as well with whatever other company. And it just creates gaps. Their
is that
policy,
not fraud?
Well, no, because by definition, you guys are named insureds, and if a named insured buys a new vehicle, it's covered.
Okay.
So we would be covering until it gets added wherever she chooses. But then also, if you think that, say that this company over here gives you 10 days to get that vehicle added, and she forgot, and it's day 15 and it gets totaled. Well, they're going to say, hey, tough luck. But over here, you've got 30 days. So then you just say, well, we'll just cover that under my policy instead. And, you just don't know between different companies all the different nuances of the policy, and it leaves you in a tough spot like that. Well, I thought I had 30 days to get it added because that's the way my company is, but it's really my wife's policy, and she's only got 10, and now we've got a vehicle totaled that she doesn't have coverage for. And it's just, when you do that, there's just different gaps of little things that you don't know that leaves you vulnerable to being in a tough spot and hurt yourself big time financially. So
I was a youth pastor for about 10 years, drove a church van all over the place with loaded full of teenagers. Actually had a pretty serious accident in a church van coming home from church camp one summer. I started driving the church van when I was probably 19, 20 years old. Then I had no clue what was going on. I was just a student ministries pastor, so I didn't deal with any of that kind of stuff. Then flash forward to when I'm a lead pastor, senior pastor of a church, and having these discussions, and our insurance representative said, to drive the church van, you have to be 25. Our youth pastor at the time was not 25. We had to have he's a church staff. Don't matter. He needs to be 25. Is that different for different policies, or is that pretty universal across the landscape of the industry?
I mean, in general, they want obviously experienced drivers, and the experienced drivers are going to hopefully be able to handle that more when there's 20 kids in the back yelling and screaming and distracting them and that kind of thing. I mean, that's what they want to protect against, is to set some kind of limit to where it's like, okay, this is a reasonable bottom line to say, 25, for example. And then, you also want to look at the people that are driving it that may be 75 or 80 that are on the other end of the spectrum of, reflexes may not be what they used to be and those kind of things. You want to be aware as a church of who you're putting in there, more so than even on the insurance side. You want to look and say, okay, is this person going to take care of our church property the way it should be taken care of? Are they going to take care of the children in the back and give the best opportunity to get them somewhere safely? And you have to think of it that way, because, that person's not who they're going to sue if their kid gets hurt. They're not going to sue that guy. They're suing the church. And you have to look at that as, hey, we've got to protect ourselves. So we don't need to toss the keys to any member of the church, because the other part is you don't really know people like you think you do. And just because they're in your church doesn't mean that they didn't have a DUI and they don't have 9 speeding tickets, because they come to church on Sunday. And that's the stuff on the insurance side. If you properly do your policy to where you send in the driver's license numbers and all this stuff of every person that will be driving it, and then on our end, we're running the MVRs and we see all that stuff, we could say, hey, this person does not need to drive the vehicle. You do not need to put this person in here. We may not air their dirty laundry out to you, but like, hey, we're not going to cover this if this person drives. You can't have your policy with us if this person's going to be actively driving these vehicles, and give you a little guidance that way too. But only if you guys are proactive with letting us know who's driving it. We always ask, give us a list of drivers, give us their driver's license numbers and their birth dates. But, people forget that down the road when they start, we need some other people to drive. We got an additional van. We need whatever. And they forget to call and add those things. And you could be opening yourself up on that negligence side that we spoke about before, of not doing your due diligence on the front end and then putting someone like that behind the wheel with children or whoever in the car with them.
That's terrifying. I've worked at a lot of churches, a lot of large churches, and been in charge of many people. I don't know that I ever said, for my volunteer who's going to be driving, I need a copy of your driver's license, and submitting that to our insurance carrier before you get behind the wheel.
It's been church to church for me. Some churches have been very like, our insurance requires, and other churches have been like, meh. I mean, we just went on a youth trip and borrowed 3 vans to go. I mean, it was not, we don't own vans. we actually went into the conversation a little bit about what would it look like to buy some vans, because our student ministries are growing, which is a great, I want to say great problem to have. It's a great blessing. Yeah. Our student ministries are growing, and we're seeing some really cool things happen. And it was like, we could probably benefit from having a van or two, because we took 70, 80 people on a mission trip this summer. And I mean, like 4 vans would not have been enough to have gotten everyone there. I think it was 4. If we'd have had 4 15-passenger vans plus another vehicle or 2, we could have done it. And that's just hard. And so it's been hit and miss with me.
Yeah, if you think about financially for your church, keeping 4 or 5 may not make sense for you at all times, because you're not going to need those. So renting some may be the best option for that, but maybe having the 1 or 2, for your normal church activities would make sense. We
talked about renting them out and stuff, and I think they started checking into the insurance and things like that.
Yeah, it's a whole different ball game when you give strangers basically the right to do whatever they want to do in your vehicle, because when they say, I'm going to run to the grocery store, you don't actually know that they're going straight there and back. Who knows what goes on with that thing. And then, we had a customer that dropped off someone at the doctor's office. They were taking their mom to the doctor. They let their boyfriend drive. He dropped them off at the front door of the doctor's office, said he was going to go park the vehicle. He had an accident like 30 minutes away from the doctor's office, and totaled the vehicle. And it was, that's obviously not within the scope of what they were supposed to be doing. He was taking the car to park it in the parking lot. Then I guess he went to the gas station and whatever else he was doing. He was just out riding around, ran a stop sign, hit something and totaled it. And, you can easily get yourself in a major situation there, because that guy could have hit somebody and killed him instead. And all he was supposed to be doing was just parking the car in the parking lot. And obviously, if from an insurance point of view, is like, is it okay if my brother-in-law, parks my car when I run into the doctor's office? Like, well, sure. But then these situations pop up where it's like, well, that's what he was supposed to be doing. But he's, we thought he was in Bristol, Tennessee. He's over in Bristol, Virginia, or Abingdon, and kill somebody. And it's like, okay, that's the reason that we have to be careful with who drives our vehicles and be so strict on these policies, because you really put a lot of faith in people to tell you the truth and to always be upfront with what they're doing. But to be honest, once you hand those keys over and you say, yeah, you can rent my vehicle, you really don't know what's going on with that thing. And you just pray that it comes back in one piece.
Yeah. And that's the thing for me, is as one of my big things with it was like, and I told him, I said, like, I'm not trying to be mean, but like, if I rent this from you for $1,500 for a week or whatever, which is, I think, about the going rate to rent a 15-passenger van for a week, which is insane to me.
It's a good business to be in.
Yeah. But I said, what happens when I get halfway from here to my destination, which is 10 hours from here? So I'm 5-6 hours from here, and the van you rented me breaks down. Like, my concern is not, do you have enough money or do you have an extra van? My only concern is, how do I get my people from the dash of where I am to the end of the destination? And they were like, well, and I'm going, again, not my problem. I don't care if it costs you $6,000 to call Enterprise, if you can even find one.
Right.
These things are like literally like mining for diamonds. Sometimes it is very hard to find a van that's suitable.
It seems like those things stay rented
all the time.
Yeah.
Except for that one close to Mahoney's. I feel like there's vans are always sitting there in the parking lot, but I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Maybe they don't have adequate insurance.
I don't know. They seem to have them there a lot, but maybe it's just a bad season right now. I don't know.
Yeah, it's wild to see that, but it does cost a fortune to rent those vans, especially for any extended period of time. But, also people, what they don't understand is when you rent like a U-Haul or a huge commercial vehicle or something, that's not something that's your personal auto policy. That's not a vehicle similar to what you carry on your policy, and you don't have automatic coverage for vehicles that aren't similar to what you have. If you've got commercial vehicle that you're renting and you got a personal auto policy, then you need to take their insurance out to cover that. Now, you're still going to be covered for your liability while you're driving, but you're not going to have any coverage on that vehicle. You need to take out that insurance at U-Haul or at Victory Van Rentals or wherever. You need to borrow to use that insurance, the $20 a day or whatever that they will cover because otherwise you're going to be paying that out of pocket when the windshield cracks or somebody backs into you back into somebody in the parking lot because you're not used to driving that van or whatever. You need to do that. But people just think like, I got insurance, it's all covered. It's not if you don't have the right policy or the right advice when you call your insurance agent and he tells you that stuff.
And this really is a big deal because, I mean, I drive around our area quite a bit. And like, I think, Tony, I don't know if you said this on air right before we started, but, the vast majority of churches would be considered small churches, under 100 people. And I cannot tell you the churches that are under 100 people that have at least one, many times 2, 3, even 4 church vans sitting in their parking lot.
Oh, yeah.
And so these are things that are a big deal. I think that a lot of churches that are probably a little bit like our style that in the last 15-ish years that launched and got started, we kind of stayed away from the church van model. I was on staff at a church one time that like we did not have church vans. It was a big church. I mean, it was almost 1,500 people, and we would take 3 charter buses on trips. I mean, but it was like, if you've got to rent 3 charter buses to go on a youth trip, why in the world would you? I mean, how many church vans would you have to own to? So we just didn't own things like that. Right. And it was a lot of carpooling when you're doing things with youth and stuff like that. Hey, we're going to go to a movie. Let's meet at the church. Or, hey, let's just meet at the movie and drop your kids off here instead of here, and those types of things. But this is a real, I think, serious conversation for a lot of the listeners we've got of, man, our parking lot has 1, 2, 3, 4 vans sitting in it. And we just toss the keys to whoever shows up that's willing to run the bus route for VBS this week. These are conversations I think people need to really have and understand. Like, you could be putting your members, your church, everything in a really bad place.
So just to summarize this for our listeners, if you have a church van and you toss the keys out to 22-year-old guy who's taking a group, he's a volunteer youth leader and is taking a group of high school boys to Sweet Frog for ice cream, and he wrecks that van, those kids get injured, the church is liable for what just happened. And the church, if those kids get hurt, or say that guy has hit someone else and is at fault and someone is injured in the other vehicle, it's the church that they're suing. It's the church that's liable,
right? Not
that driver of the vehicle, not the 22-year-old who caused the accident.
And they can always go after people individually too as drivers, but they're going to go after the person that has funds that they can get.
And they can go after the elders, deacons of the church, correct?
I would assume that they would be able to kind of go after whoever gave that permission. They would probably just do the church as a whole, just that organization, and say that they were, they didn't do their due diligence on this driver to see, what his history was or whatever before they tossed the keys. If you would have done better research as to who it was driving that vehicle, then you wouldn't have let them drive, and it would have prevented all this. And now this is on you guys. And the other thing that you mentioned about the small churches with 3 or 4 vans sitting around, what they're not going to think of and what they're going to do is say, we don't use these all the time. If someone wants to rent them, that's extra income for our church that we need as a small church. And they're not thinking anything of that. And they're going to let those people do it too, which if you have them insured that way, that's fine. But if you don't, then when you're making money off of that church van, that's not the same as running your kids around. And now that's a whole different business. And that's when you need that different insurance plan to cover the whole thing comprehensively for driving the kids around and rental. And that's the part that's going to get people that they're never going to think of, because they're like, well, it's a church van and it's covered, but now I'm making money off of this church van, and that's a whole different risk.
So I'm going to sound maybe even a touch hypocritical with what I'm about to say here, because there are a lot of churches that have decided, since people seemingly aren't going to tithe anymore, we're going to create secondary incomes with things. Right. In that, our church has a bakery in it that rents a space and does things. It is a benefit. I'm not going to deny that at all. But our church is on Main Street in Irwin.
Yeah.
And so we didn't want to just be closed and not be a benefit to the downtown area because, as you know, I mean, from this area and stuff, I mean, you're downtown in Irwin, you take up a building for a church that's only open a couple days a week. You really are taking up prime real estate that community needs. And so we did it in a purpose of being in this space. But what you're talking about right there, a lot of churches, and again, I'm not denying the fact that it is a benefit, and we knew that when we did it several years ago when we opened that campus. But like, there are a lot of churches that are doing this. I'll call it side hustle, maybe for lack of a better word. You guys smarter than me, you can upgrade that word if we need to be more fair or whatever. But this side hustle mentality of, if people aren't going to tithe, we will generate income. There's so much of that going on. People renting your facility,
which is great. It's innovative.
Yes,
it is.
They need to do that stuff to survive.
My win is not so much the fact of, I still think we need to biblically teach people to tithe. My thing is, I don't think the church should have ever been created and closed 6 days a week and open 1 day a week. Got these huge buildings. So rent it out. I mean, let people use the facility and be in that space. But all of these things require a different level of insurance, not just, oh, hey, you're renting your space out. So-and-so's coming in and using it for meetings for a week. That's not the same thing as you having church on Sunday.
Right. I mean, and if you think about it in terms of a landscaper, for example, you come in and get a general liability policy and you say, I mow and I weed eat and that's it. Well, then you go out and you're taking down trees, huge trees all the way from the ground down. You're not just pruning a couple limbs that are in your way when you're mowing. You're cutting that big tree down. Well, you didn't mention that up front. So your general liability page states that you do this and this. And then when you go out and do this, that's not something that you're covered for. You start putting in irrigation, you need to have it listed on your general liability policy that you are doing irrigation, that you are cutting down the trees, you are pressure washing the roof, you are cleaning the gutters, that you are pressure washing driveways. If you don't have those things listed when you buy your general liability, you don't have coverage for them. It's not just, pay us $100 and we'll just cover whatever. We need to know what it is that we're covering and rate for that properly. But, just like the church, okay, church, you got a business owner policy, and that's more of a broad general liability that's got a lot of different things included. And, for all intents and purposes, church related things that you'll be doing are going to be they don't have to be named specifically in some of that stuff. Some of that stuff is going to be incorporated. So it's not the same way as a landscaper where we need to know every little thing that you're doing. However, if you are going from doing church-related activities to business-related activities in a completely different industry, to where you have a bakery or a coffee shop or something running out of the same space that they're paying you rent, and they are giving you a portion of the sales or whatever, then it needs to be listed that I've got this other business on our premises that adds foot traffic on days that we're not even open, and no members of the church are here to supervise.
Yeah.
And people don't think about that because they think, well, the church has insurance. Well, the church has insurance for church related things, but the bakery on premises, when your building's closed and there are no church officers present to make sure that everything is as safe as it can be, and you've got, say 100 people a day coming in and out, who's covering that? Because
so the small church that holds services on Sunday mornings, Wednesday nights, and then on Friday nights, they let the local Trail Life troop come in and use their facility. Does that need to be spoken to their insurance that we're letting Trail Life use this facility? We're letting a consignment company come in on Saturdays and do a consignment sale in our fellowship hall. Are those all types of things that need to be disclosed to their insurance? Anything
that you're going to be doing should be disclosed, just so that they can tell you for sure. Hey, if you're doing that and you are making money, we need to do this. If you're doing this and you're, just allowing someone to use your space, you're not making money off of it. It's a member of the church who's running this, Eagle Scouts group that they want to meet in your all's basement or whatever. If they are not charging money for those things, that's completely different, and that may just be something that is covered under the comprehensive liability of the policy. But once you turn that into something that's making money for you, or you're trading services and those kind of things, then you get into, okay, we need to look at the specifics in your policy and see, are you going to be covered for that? Do we need to add something to that? Do we need to write a separate policy for you for that type of business to make sure that there are no gaps here?
I think we now have a lot of listeners that are quickly putting their notes down saying, I've got to call my insurance agent.
I'm making a couple of notes of some questions to ask. Yeah.
And I hope so. I hope that that's what we accomplished today, because so many people think that everything's covered by the one premium they pay. And no matter what they do, they're going to have coverage. And that can't be, but no insurance company could survive that way. Everything that you want to do is covered for this $100. There's no way. We have to know what you're doing and rate it specifically. Otherwise, we would all be out of business basically. And, when you had a claim that needed to be paid, we wouldn't have enough money to do that.
Yeah. Kris, we touched a little bit earlier on sexual misconduct. Are there any organizational policies that you would say every church needs to have these, that they are utilizing, that they are practicing, and that they are strictly observing in order to help mitigate the chances of sexual misconduct claim against them?
Absolutely. So when you add that coverage on, when we go in and do a quote, that's a coverage that we've got on there that you can just click on and pick the limit, and you go from there. But when you do that, it adds additional underwriting questions that need to be asked, and they want to know if you have like a set church policy or handbook to how those types of claims are handled, the investigations that are done, the background checks on all of the church members or leaders that are going to be in those situations where they may be in the nursery or, doing counseling or whatever that case may be, that the background checks have been done, that there have been trainings done with the church staff to recognize signs of sexual abuse, those kind of things. And if those boxes aren't checked, until those things are checked, you cannot have that coverage. So it's not just, hey, we'll cover you for that. Like, you need to take the proper steps at your church to protect your church against these things, and we'll throw the general liability on top of that. But just like anything else, you need to do these things yourself to protect yourself. Just like, cleaning your gutters or doing whatever at your home to protect your home from further abuse, you need to do that at the church or a business, to where you have employee handbooks and those kind of things on how to handle situations, what signs to look for, train them to look for these things, list out specific things that you should and should not be doing. You should not be alone. In the nursery, you should always have a second person there when you are changing diapers.
Unrelated, usually, right?
Yeah, somebody that is, seemingly a neutral party. If you're going to be in there changing diapers, that's going to be, for example, like my wife, we leave them in the church nursery. If they need a diaper changed, she wants them to call us for us to come do it. And some churches should have that same policy of, hey, we're not going to change this diaper without the parent's permission, or we are not going to change diapers. We are going to call the parent back in here and have them do it, because that's going to absolve us of, that's just one issue that's off the table. And, and things like that. You need to have policies in place that protect you.
Yeah, I was CEO at the Y, and when we were all very high level background check, and in that space, we still, because of what our level of certification was, not the background check, but the level of certification, we couldn't change diapers. So parents who kind of dropped their kids off as the mom's morning out, like the workout, like childcare, we literally would have to text them in the middle of their run, and they'd have to stop the treadmill, come in, change their child, and go back. If their kid needed to go to the bathroom, we could not walk them. If they were maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years old and old enough to go, we couldn't walk them to the bathroom back. We had to text that parent. We had to activate the call system to get that parent to come in and take them. And so,
exactly.
And there are some parents that were very frustrated in that space. And they're like, just change the diaper. But it is like, this is a legal thing. Oh, yeah. And if the powers that be walk in and see us doing this, like
fired.
we're done. I mean, like they could shut our entire facility down.
Yeah, in my experience, large churches do a pretty good job of this, that they have the employee handbooks, the policies and procedures that are in place.
And they've got the volume of volunteers to handle that.
And they're adequately training their volunteers, requiring that. They have a process that you have to go through. Background checks are a must. Smaller churches really don't do that.
It's a warm body mentality.
It really is. I had someone just in the last probably 2 months call me that was new to a church, a small church in our area. And they called me and said, I just found out that this church has never done background checks before on their children's workers. What company do you recommend? I mean, and this is a long, old, established church that has any people that have been working there, and they had some that have been working in their children's ministry and youth ministries for decades, have never been background checked. And just simple things like that so many church leaders, I think, don't even think of. They're not aware that needs to happen.
Yeah, you just take it for granted. And it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, where people think that, well, these people are in our church. These are people we know. That can never happen. Those people would never do that. And that's, I don't think anybody expects that behavior out of anyone, that they would leave with their children. But yet we see that in the news time after time that's happened. And, people have to take off that mentality of, everybody that goes to church they would never do that. They would never bring harm to our church. They would never, cause anything that would cause us to be in a liability suit. They would never do that inappropriate stuff with a church staff member or a child or whatever. And the likelihood is you generally don't know that about anybody, to be honest. And you see that play out in the media, unfortunately, because all the negative stuff makes the news. And you see that, but you have to use that and say, okay, this could actually happen to anybody. And if we aren't protected against that, then we're just leaving ourselves hanging out to dry.
How liable is the pastor of a church in a sexual misconduct situation, even if they had nothing to do with it?
Well, the issue is, part of that officers and directors type coverage, hey, did you all have the proper stuff in place here to protect against that? Because if not, you guys are negligent in that. Did you have some other supervision in there when these people were with the children or with whoever, or was everybody doing it alone and you guys just kind of turned a blind eye to it? Did this person have an allegation or two in the past that you swept under the rug and you said, he would never do that, and it kind of died out, and you guys are kind of aware of this prior, and now it's happened again, and now it's got some substance to it, and now we are in big trouble. So yeah, they're always going to be, as the board of trustees, the deacons, the pastors, the youth leaders, those people are looked at as being the leadership of the church, and that they need to watch out for those things. And a lot of people just have that mentality that it'll never happen to us and that person will never do that. And they kind of, let people do their own thing. We'll let them supervise the nursery themselves. That's a good person. And then, next thing you know, there's a lawsuit on the church and the church is having a big issue. And then they can come after, specifically somebody just sue the pastor specifically and not the church. And then he's got to have his own coverage for that, because your business owner policy is covering the business. It's not covering the individuals all the time. So,
but that officers and directors policy will help with that.
Yeah. Yes, it does help with that.
And I sit on boards of several organizations and have throughout the years, and a lot of them have had things. I know at the Y, it was something very clear that when people signed on there in that role, it was you carry the responsibility of the organization. And some of that is not just, hey, so be aware, like be around. It is, you need to understand a lawsuit will have, you will be the one in court.
Right. You need to be proactive to prevent that stuff.
Yeah. And so you'll be the one in court when that happens.
All right. We're running out of time. We've touched on a lot here. You mentioned something before we started recording, and you've also mentioned it here in recording. And we want to talk a little bit about other important insurance considerations that churches might have. And I think the big one that I've gathered from you is that the importance of an umbrella policy.
Umbrella policy is very important nowadays, more so than ever, because of the litigious environment that we're in. Everybody's going to sue. Everybody's going to come after the max they can get. And you want to make sure that everything that they can get is protected by that liability limit. We've got so many people, it's easy to talk about car insurance and bodily injury because, we've seen that stuff firsthand. and 25,000 for bodily injury, just because the state says that's enough for them, doesn't mean that's enough for really anything. One night at the ER or one night at the hospital, 30,000, 35,000. With surgeries, who knows what else. 2 nights at the hospital, 65,000, and that's, people don't carry those limits because they're not forced to. But they can still somebody can still come after their home and their wages and everything else because of the way that they have neglected to insure themselves. So the umbrella policy kicks in there. You cover all these underlying things, and then the umbrella policy comes in and gives you that extra layer of protection on top of that. Should the lawsuit get to be larger than what that general liability limit's going to cover, you've got some extra to kick in so that the church's assets are still protected, and your general business or your personal life is still protected. You want to make sure. Some of the things that people don't know is that uninsured motorist coverage and is that's on your auto policy at a lot of places, or you can add it at a lot of places. But in your umbrella policy, it's not just always there. You add that onto an umbrella policy to have those limits kick in up to $2 million. And a lot of places, I think a lot of insurance agents don't really know that or pay attention to that. But that's something that I just had a guy the other day. I talked to you about a house I insured out in Gray that was a larger house. Well, he was, he showed me his umbrella policy, and I was like, do you know that you don't have uninsured motorist on here? And he's like, well, no. I just assumed that, since my car insurance has it, our umbrella would have that. And he said, because that's our biggest concern is that somebody's going to hit us and hurt us and they don't have coverage. And I was like, well, that's actually not going to be something that you have that coverage for because you didn't add that on and nobody told you. And, that's the same with the church. You've got to have we go back to having an insurance agent that goes over that stuff with you. Hey, these are the things that you have and need and would really benefit from carrying. But, this umbrella policy, people think that $1 million of liability or $2 million of liability would cost so much. If you've got a house and 2 cars, it costs you $135 a year. And you're like, well, gosh, for $10 a month, basically, I could have $1 million of coverage. But people think $1 million is like, we could never afford to have that coverage, or if we did, that would put us in a financial bind, even though we need that really to protect our stuff because our property values have gone up and we've got nice vehicles and I've got a good income or whatever. And it's like, no, that's, it's $135. And people start to be like, oh, so, I bet you I've sold more umbrellas in the last 6 or 8 months than I did in the 3 or 4 years prior to that. It's just become a hot topic.
Does a lot of that have to do, and I know we're get really cramped on time and I don't want to keep you too long. Does a lot of it have to do with the fact though, that things are getting so much more expensive that people are looking and going, man, used to, I could have replaced my car for $8,000, $10,000, $12,000. Now that same thing is $18,000 to $40,000. My youngest son really wants a truck, and I'm going, you can get something with 864,000 miles on it for about $4,500, or you can find 20 grand. And that's about the 2 choices that you've got. And so, he drives what's available and he's not upset, but he really wants a truck. But that's kind of this thing is now, insurance is like people are so concerned. And so it's how can I get cheaper? And it might be time to start going, I might need to give up Starbucks once a month.
Right.
Or once a week to where I actually take care of my family, not my addiction.
Right. And you've got to have your priorities set.
And the same thing for the church. I don't know what the church needs to give up. In that space, we might need to, cancel the church Netflix account or whatever it is that's going on.
Your church has a Netflix
No,
account?
it does not. We have Right Now Media, which we pay for. But we have Right Now Media, not Netflix.
Buy the coffee from Sam's Club instead of buy the Starbucks blend for the, whatever, just something negligent that would, the $10 a month extra you spend on the coffee, you cut it back and you spend it on liability.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Kris, a couple other quick questions I want to get to that I think are important. How often should a church be reviewing their policy with their insurance agent?
Used to, we would set reviews at every 2 or 3 years a lot of times. And now when you have a business and you've got a large building and whatever, you really need to look at that each year when it comes to renewal. You need to call them and just say, hey, just real quickly, look at this renewal of mine. Tell me if you think that everything looks good. And then also the agent needs to be like, hey, has anything changed since we did this last year, the year before? You guys doing any side hustles? Or you guys, did you buy any new church vans? Do you guys have any new drivers we need to add? you guys make any improvements to the structure that, now would cost an extra $200,000 to rebuild? Do we need to know those things? Because when you're trusting us to make sure that in that time of need, it's covered. But if we don't get together and ask those questions, we can't really give you that reassurance, because that policy you bought 10 years ago, you feel good about it. There's so much that's changed over those years and so many different coverages that can be added. And, the cost of building materials has gone through the roof in the last, 3 or 4 years. All those things, the value of your building and your land has gone up. So your liability limit may not be proper to protect it all. And that's where your umbrella comes in. A couple different things that you'd sent over that we haven't really gone over, and I'll just try to do this quickly. Key man insurance. That's something that you can add a rider on those policies or at some places. And, say that you get $10,000 in the event that the pastor is unable to fulfill his duties due to an accident or, something like that, to where you've got money to spend on advertising to get someone else in, or to pay for, whatever kind of issues that you may need there to attract a new pastor, to get yourself back financially to someone that was very important, who brought in a lot of, new members and, caused people to bring in more tithes and all those things.
The area I dealt with that personally, that I had a church that I was the lead pastor at, that our leadership said in a meeting with our insurance agent, said, you need to have key man insurance. And I said, no, I'm not that important. And they said, right. Yes, you are. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm not that important. The church isn't about me, being very humble in that. Right. But they brought out a great point. They said, forget about it. If something happens and you die, then the church is going to find someone else to replace you. And that's going to be great. That's not what we're talking about. He said, for us, the biggest concern is, what if you get really sick? What if you get in an accident and you're going to be out for 6 months? The church now has to pay for someone else to come in an interim. They're still, if they're a good church, they're still paying your salary. Right. And they need to pay for someone else to come in and preach and teach every Sunday. They're bringing in guest speakers, someone like that. This key man coverage kicks in and saying, our key guy, who has to be, my understanding is they have to be named, as the insurance is on this individual. It's not just on your organization as a whole. You have it on the individual. So Northridge would have it on Robert Kell. And if something happens to Robert where he's not able to fulfill his duties in that role that are spelled out, that it kicks in and provides coverage to this to help in those situations.
Right. And the other thing that we see a lot of too is, and I've got this for a few of the churches in the area, to where they do a key man life policy on the pastor, not just like, if he's disabled, we need the extra $10,000 to recruit and advertise and do whatever. But, say that we pay this policy for this person, then the church would receive this money back tax-free should something happen to him. The church can use that then to go and recruit and do all this other stuff, but also they can use that to maybe use as a severance for the family to say, hey, well, you've lost your husband, he's lost the paycheck, all that stuff. Here is, great. A year's salary. Here is funeral expenses covered. Here is a little bit of money to help you guys get transitioned. And, the cost of that is negligent, I'm sure, depending on the age and the health and all those things of the pastor. Negligent in the overall sense of what kind of benefit we can give to him, versus, paying a bigger salary or doing those things. Because at that time, when something happens to him, the family needs some help transitioning and doing all this other stuff. And the church is able to do that then when they have that type policy. The churches have done everything from paying, a monthly $25 a month or something for a policy, to taking a lump sum of money that the church has that, churches really aren't able to invest or do anything like that a lot of times due to whatever their guidelines are. But they could take that and just set it over there in a life insurance policy and say that, the church would gain some interest on that over time, but also, say that they did $100,000, they may get back 150, and that 50 would then pay the family to do whatever they need to do. And then they still got their principal of the 100, and they didn't actually spend any money during that interim because that money just went from a savings to a different type of savings and they went on. So people do it a million different ways, but the key man insurance on someone that is vital to bringing in church revenue, that may be out in the community doing things, fundraising, all this, has a great reputation. It does hurt the church financially to lose somebody like that. No matter how humble you are, whatever you think, if you've been out, you started this church, you have a great following, people do sometimes start to look other places when they've lost the person that they loved being their pastor.
Definitely.
And then that puts the church in a financial strain. And if you don't have these other things in place, it could cost a lot of transition. Eventually maybe the tithing picks back up and those kind of things. But in that, it's always about that transition period where churches could get in trouble.
I love that. That's a great benefit that you can offer to your staff.
Yeah.
That maybe as part of their employment package, their benefits. I think that's a great thing to show that you care about them, you care about their family, and you care about their overall well-being and future. Yeah, I love that. Kris, you're licensed in the state of Tennessee. Are you anywhere else?
We are unable to sell the Tennessee Farmers Mutual Insurance Company policies outside of the borders of Tennessee. So life insurance stuff is a little different. It can be kind of almost any state, but property and auto has to stay within the boundaries of Tennessee.
Okay. So we have a lot of listeners from outside of Tennessee. What should someone listening to this that is saying, we don't have any of this, or I need to review this, what should they be looking for, not only in a policy, but in an agent?
In an agent, referrals are a huge thing. A lot of times, if someone asked you and you said, well, Kris does this and he sits down with me and goes over this stuff, that's an important trait to have in somebody that you're looking for. So asking, your fellow churches, who they use and how they go about their reviews and things like that, you can maybe find somebody that's doing something a little bit better than what you've been accustomed to. Unfortunately, Google reviews and things like that are important. They sound kind of ridiculous, but to think of, this person has this many clients and they're satisfied or whatever, those are big things too. But also be with a company, if it's a broker or whoever they pick for you or bring you presentations for, you really need to look at their financial rating and financial strength, because you want that to be somebody that is not going to be in the situation where they have to have 75% rate increases because they really don't have that surplus that they need to be writing that big of a risk or whatever the case may be. So you always want to look at financially, A-rated, A+ rated, anything A and above is usually pretty good. And you want to make sure that they've got an A-rated company, because they really, your insurance agent is excellent. That's great. But at the time that you need a claim, the insurance agent's not the person writing the check. They've just advised you on where to go. And you want to make sure that that place that they sent you is some place that can handle your business and what you've got going on.
Kris, you've got about 1,000 church leaders from around the country that are listening to this right now. What would you want to say to them, just in closing? Maybe it has nothing at all to do with insurance. What?
I will stay on the topic of insurance a little bit for that, just for the fact of, don't just trust anybody with that most sacred gift there of having, the church. That's something that could all be taken away because you put trust in someone kind of negligently. Just, I hate to put it that way, but, make sure that you do dot your T's and dot your I's and cross your T's and whatever else for everybody that you have involved in the leadership of the church, because that person could take away everything that you've worked hard for and also ruin that reputation that you've worked so hard to build. Even more important than the building, the building, whatever, those can always be rebuilt. But the reputation of a church stands on those people that are involved in the leadership. And, while anything could happen with anybody that you do 100 background checks on, if you're not doing those things, you've really done a disservice to, the members of the church, in my opinion there, just like any other business. If you're not doing the things you need to be doing on a daily basis, with the handbooks and the trainings and the guidance and those kind of things, there's really no cost associated with that other than maybe printing it out, the ink. Otherwise, it's just a little bit of time and effort of going the extra mile on that to say, okay, we're going to protect this thing that we've built. And, somebody could take it down so easily if we don't do these little things. And they're really no cost to the church, just more of awareness and preparation to prevent these things in the future.
And not all background checks are created equal.
Absolutely not.
You can really skimp on that if you just want to do it for the sake of rubber stamping it and saying you've done it.
Right.
And the background check is only for your state or even your county. Is there a company that you would recommend to our listeners doing background checks through?
I do not have anyone to recommend specifically on that, but I would always recommend a national background check because, who knows? where they
Right.
were and
Right.
what they've done in the past, just because they've been in Tennessee for 5 years and they've been good, or, whatever it may pull. You want to do that as a national thing. And, even little things like, choosing to pull the credit on those things, that tells a lot too. Not everybody who has bad credit or those things may be a higher risk, but also you want to know, is this person, do they take pride in these things because they're taking pride in the church?
Yeah.
It just, anything can happen to anybody that they would
You probably shouldn't put someone with bad credit on your finance committee.
Right. You need to pull those things for certain positions. You need to make sure that, if I can't handle my finances, I can't handle the church's finances, or I shouldn't be.
Right.
And if you do let that person in there, then you're going to be negligent when they misappropriate funds, or, something goes wrong in that sense. It's like, we kind of could have seen this coming, but we chose not to. And, it's unfortunate, but you have to pay attention to those things.
Kris, if we have listeners that are in the state of Tennessee that have heard what you've said today and they want to get in contact with you, have you look at their church policies or maybe their individual policies, how can someone get a hold of you?
Typically, my cell phone's out there wherever you can find it, 276-971-1683. It's on my business cards, up on our website, any of that stuff. My office is located in Piney Flats, which is right outside of Johnson City. You can call my office there. I've got a great staff. We've got another agent there named Michael. All of us will be able to help you out on that, regardless of where you do your business, or, if you just don't have a great relationship with your agent, but you want somebody just to review it with you, we're also happy to do that. It's not just about selling a Farm Bureau policy. We're happy to say, hey, these are the areas that you need to go back to your agent and see if you can get some protection for, or call this 1-800 number where you've gotten this policy and say, hey, right here are some areas that we need to address. And if you guys don't offer these, I need to get these. Or if you do offer them, what's it going to cost us to add these things on, or what limits do you offer? Just to be able to review them with people and say, hey, be aware of what you have. Doesn't mean you have to switch to Farm Bureau. Doesn't mean that, we're the world's best, church policy or anything like that. We just want you to, if you have a little bit of an education on these things, you know what to watch out for, and that you guys are protected like you should be.
That's great. Well, that's all the time that we have for this edition of the Small Church Podcast. We want to really thank Kris Null, agent at Tennessee Farm Bureau Insurance, for sitting down with us for the last hour and 15 minutes or so to discuss some things that I think are critically important for really anyone who's listening. So if you would like to reach out to Kris, you can find him Tennessee Farm Bureau Insurance, and he is at the Piney Flats office. Again, Kris Null. All of his contact information will be in the show notes. But we hope that this episode has been enlightening, educational, and hopefully a little bit entertaining for you. Hopefully it's got you thinking and asking some questions about what you need to be doing in your life and your organization. We do want to thank you for tuning into this edition. Invite you to follow us on Facebook, subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, like and share our show. The more people that listen to our show, the more people get to hear great content like what we've heard from Kris today. So again, higherministries.com, Facebook, Higher Ministries. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for the next edition of the Small Church Podcast.